It is my pleasure to get to collaborate with these amazing women and to share some time today with you all for not just free CLE credit, but also great wisdom on looking back on 2025 and ahead to 2026. For me, I'm also a public company board member, as well as dabbling in academics and a practicing attorney. For anyone interested in further education, for board members, we are currently accepting applicants for the NASDAQ NYU certificate in cybersecurity. So we highly recommend folks consider that. And if you're interested in the rigorous year-long program, like Anna and Lisa did, we have our one-year master's in cybersecurity available currently, also taking applications. So, fabulous panelists. Looking back and looking ahead, what would you see as the biggest cybersecurity threats for 2025, and what might we expect either same or different in the year ahead?
I can start perhaps. It's interesting because I think just the basic threat of, what individuals do with, phishing attacks are still, to me, some of the more basic things that we're seeing. But obviously, with the advent and sort of acceleration of AI, we're seeing a whole new landscape of threats, that are AI generated. And so that's escalating both on the attacker, threat attacks, as well as, forcing us to do a lot more from a defense perspective. So I think still traditional, don't click those those links, and then AI deep fakes, malware, and those types of things.
Yeah, I would second that. I think the threats are somewhat similar to the past, but much better and more sophisticated. And I have I'm personally aware of companies that have hired North Korean you can call them hackers, you can call them workers, generating income for the regime. I have friends who have gotten calls on, your daughter has been kidnapped, and very, very realistic voice impersonations that have gone on. So I think those do remain the most prevalent. And I do think for those of us who are the NYU crowd, Ed Amoroso had a great line about this that his theory was that as the cyber threats grew, the anti-cyber threats would also begin using AI, and I'm sure Anna's very aware of this. And he likened it to having a humidifier and a dehumidifier in a room fighting it out. So I think we will get there, but right now I would say the humidifier is winning a little bit because it's just these actors are taking advantage of the tools in new and interesting ways that we need to be aware of.
I would agree with everything that has been said. I would say there is a lot of extortion out there with these threat actors. We have to remember that these are criminals and they are motivated by an incentive. And as long as the incentive is there, they're going to be acting and they have new tools. And so you're seeing extortion. You're seeing a lot of third-party risk, a lot of third-party attacks that are impacting the third parties and then the companies that use them. There are still some zero-day attacks. The AI attack was really of interest, but there's also been CLOP that is still doing the zero-day attacks, and there's a social engineering, and still there's the DPRK. So it's a very, very active environment, and I would anticipate the same will continue for 2026 and beyond.
Excellent points. And I do think that the AI versus AI, the humidifier, dehumidifier challenge is certainly something at the fore of everyone's minds in this space, or should be. But we can't overlook the human element as still, the human firewall still being so critically important. Where are we on that thermostat? Because we're the ones who are clicking on the phishing links or falling for the AI attacks or not appropriately leveraging good technology to keep our organizations or systems safe. And I think that's still critically important
It is. And I think the hard part about that is that the social engineering is improving to the point that it is very difficult to discern that that is what is happening. So, and I think AI will just sort of intensify their ability to make it look more realistic.
And we're seeing a lot of information in terms of how AI-enabled threats is making this world scarier. The deep fake videos and voice and photographs to not know what's real versus not real. The phishing attacks being so interesting, the AI or persuasive, and AI being able to find the vulnerabilities much faster and leverage attacks at scale. But let's talk for a little bit about a happy side for a moment. What are some of the benefits and opportunities with regard to AI?
I think, the ability to leverage AI for defensive actions, from a cyber perspective is really taking off. And, being able to have AI plus humans, let's say even, security analysts and folks like that, really augmenting what a human can do with AI capabilities is really important. And examples would be faster triage, auto investigation for, what are the issues, the ability to really look at attack paths for where these threat actors are coming in. So I think AI, there's a huge amount of positive capability that AI is giving us, plus the scale, right? So being able to do a lot of this faster and at much larger scale, is really beneficial. I think from a company perspective, also being able to be preventive and predictive. So not just when there's issues from a cyber perspective, but being able to actually leverage AI in our ML ops tooling, in the way that we deliver products, I think makes for a safer outcome from a product perspective, and then looking at, I would say that the most important part probably for AI is, can it help us look at vulnerabilities within data itself? Because AI is based on training models, right? So I think that's another place where AI can be beneficial, right, to help us with those processes.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think, I would say we are tiptoeing toward a place where we have self-healing organizations where the AI detects and then the AI takes action agentically to address the issue. Logic Monitor, one of the companies that I work with, is beginning to do some of that stuff. I will say, a lot of this is fairly new and nascent, but I think we will get there. And I think that's a really interesting place to be. I would say, aside from the cyber aspects of this, which I think everybody, needs to be hyper aware of, and is obviously why we're all here. I think, the real, interesting place for this, for companies to be talking about this in the boardroom, in the C-suite, is how do we leverage AI in our business and we use it to advance the organization. So my former company, Diligent, did a survey in August with corporate board member, and they looked at where are the opportunities broadly in the business environment. And I will tell you, AI would not have shown up on this list 3 or 4 years ago. It was the number one thing, ahead of things like M&A, capital allocation, supply chain diversification, shareholder engagement. It was ahead of all of those. It was the number one thing on how do we take advantage of some of these tools to make our business better, faster, more responsive, more personalized. And those are some of the places where companies are really leaning in. Often directly, sometimes via suppliers and technology partners who are providing that for them. But I think you would be remiss as a leader in your organization if you were not looking at these tools as ways to better your business. And if you look at it, going back to more of the audit cyber lens, if you say, we used to do hand samples of things for things like SOX. And now we are able to look at an entire sample and detect things that would have been sort of, not hitting the level of human pattern recognition earlier. But because we can look at 100% of things, we can now detect things that we weren't able to detect before. So I think there will be things like that in the cyber realm, but it also in the block and tackle. How do we run our company better, and how do we make sure that we are looking at things like fraud and just bad practices and not efficient operations, and leverage AI for those things. And that is possibly, the most interesting current application for AI.
Excellent.
And I would just
Excellent.
add there that, it's a lot of talk about AI, particularly some of the newer things as it relates to legal, is around efficiency. And that's really interesting. But I think the flip side of that is really the unlock. I think the unlock there really is about the capacity that you gain from the efficiency and what you can do with it. And so while a lot of the sales pitches are around that efficiency, which is hugely important, and I don't want to diminish the importance of it, I think the question is what you do with the capacity and how you can use that additional capacity to forward your mission or your strategy or your operations. And I think that's one of the ways that it is hugely transformative. It will allow people to do more things. It will allow you to have the capacity to do other things because you have the AI to help you have, a broader view and to do routine tasks. But what happens with the rest of that capacity, I think, is a good question. And I think that's part of the promise of it that we have not talked about.
Really great points. Thank you. And Jocelyn, let me stay with you for a moment on the legal side of things. As organizations are leveraging AI to assist in drafting or reviewing materials, what are some of the considerations to appropriately and responsibly manage risk around data privacy, legal privilege, audit trails?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I think you have to be very thoughtful before you begin to use these tools. There are just a huge number of risks that could occur from you using these tools. One is accuracy. I don't know if everyone has seen, but there have been instances in which attorneys and judges have used AI to help draft their opinions or their briefs, and they have been flat wrong. And they've had the embarrassing occurrence of having that called out and then having everyone understand that they relied solely on the AI to do the drafting. You can't do that because there are still hallucinations and there are still accuracy issues, and it isn't a complete replacement for the human eye. It is a tool that you can use, but you still own the outcome, so you still have to review it. The other thing I would say is you've got to be concerned about IP sort of ownership, copyright issues, because you don't know what has gone into a model and what the output might be and whether the model has the right to use it, and then therefore you could be in violation. So you've got to be thinking when you're contracting about using these types of tools about where the input comes from, getting the improper indemnifications, understanding that. And then there's also what you mentioned. There's privacy, there's confidentiality, there's attorney-client privilege. You got to be thinking about what is going into the tool and what happens with the information you put into it. Is it sort of a private instance that's just within your entity, or is it public? If it's public, you've got to be concerned about these issues, dramatically, because they are being used to train, the model to do other things for others. And that's not what you want. And you can violate those tenets by doing it. And so you've got to be thoughtful about that. And even if you have a private instance, if you are inputting things that are confidential or are attorney-client privilege, and they're going to be shared with people who do not have either the need or the right or are not within the cone of the privilege, then you could violate those tenets. So you just have to be very thoughtful about what you're doing when you're working in this area.
And we have an audience question along these lines, and I'll just note that we're going to try to work in some of the fantastic questions that we got in advance. And for those who want to ask questions in real time, you can use our Q&A chat function, and we'll get to as many as we can today. But Jonathan Hubner is asking, how do we help our enterprise or other enterprises not leak protected data through employees who are using AI models, both internal and third-party models? So
I think you've got to do some degree of training. You need to have some degree of governance around what AI uses are allowed in your company. And then you've got to have some standards. I mean, I think a lot of people have set up governance groups. A lot of entities have governance groups that actually oversee what AI usage is in the company. And along with that, they have guidelines about what is allowed and what is not allowed. But I would say, you've got to look at it from soup to nuts through the life of AI, because a lot of times people are often now doing pilots, and so you're piloting and trying to see if it works. Well, what happens when the pilot's over? What happens with that data? You've just got to be thinking about it through the whole life cycle.
I would add to that I would urge companies not to be naive about this. Your employees are using LLMs. They will use LLMs. If you give them a corporate LLM to use and train them on it, and tell them this is the one to use, and feed it with your own data so that it's more useful to them, and work out with your legal team and your CISO what needs to happen to make sure that contractually your data is your data and it's not leaving your four walls. Then I think you're in the best possible place. You still need to be aware that for things like where I interact on board work, you want to make sure that even if a model is internal to a company, that the access to the information that may be fed to that, if you have your team prepping board books and doing summaries for your CEO in there, is that somehow putting the data into that internal LLM? So you have sort of secondary issues thinking through how do you guardrail some of the access to data even internally. But most certainly you can guardrail the stuff that would go externally and refeed back into an LLM. And honestly, it's the cost of an analyst. Just like there's literally no excuse to just not do it.
I can add maybe one perspective, which is a lot of the tooling or SaaS tools, et cetera, that we're using today are putting in sort of security guardrails to help companies, be able to safeguard their data. So, I would definitely urge folks to look at the IT, tooling that they have. And so, for example, whether it's, engineering, it's not just, by the way, documentations and stuff like that. It's code as well, right? It's open source. It's, all the data that we're leveraging, with LLMs, making sure that, we protect that. So automate, don't rely just on people to do the right thing.
Yeah, excellent points. And also to understand and expect, if we've learned nothing from cybersecurity, people will defeat or overcome the guardrails in place. So having extra protections and flags. And it also applies to board members and executives, to understand, even if you're using a proprietary system for one enterprise, you can't input proprietary information from another enterprise that is violating certain guardrails. And so, for third parties and advisors to appreciate that aspect too, in terms of how they use proprietary systems and what they put in, and recognize all systems, as secure as we try to make it, could be vulnerable. So let's talk a little bit about AI transformation and oversight in terms of the board's involvement. There's always this tension of the board, noses in, fingers out, right? Not over managing the company, but something like strategic planning and transformation on something that's such a critically important issue is something we presume should be discussed. So how should boards be thinking about this, talking about this? And is it part of a particular committee? Anna, I'll start with you.
Yeah, so first of all, I think it's really important for every board to ask themselves, how is my business leveraging, AI today, right? And that goes on two fronts. One is AI as part of whatever the service or product that we deliver for customers. And the second one is ourselves, whether it's for efficiency or improvement. What do we need to do? Um, in terms of sort of where that conversation happens, I think it's important, by the way, to have this AI conversation directly at the board, at the board level, because it's a business conversation, right? But then we're seeing the advent of many more sort of technology committees that are being formed, and those aren't just about AI or cyber uh, protection or risk, but they're also about business strategy. So I believe it's important to look at both internal use for productivity and how do we immediately look at our products, and our services to make them AI first, right? And then from there, how do we have that as a business conversation at every one of our boards? By the way, I don't know if you remember, but when over the decades we've had mobile first and cloud first and SaaS first, et cetera, right? These movements. And what's interesting about AI is you don't hear AI first. What you hear is AI native, and what that means is that the time scale for adoption of this is a lot faster. And so I think that, for boards, we need to say, okay, how is this immediately impacting our business? We can't wait necessarily to assess. We need to have a point of view, today.
Yeah, as usual, I'm in radical agreement with Anna. I will say a couple of things to add to that. I think that some companies have early on made the mistake of saying this is an issue for the CIO, and the CIO is now tasked with how to go implement AI and make sure that we're, staying on top of these things. And I would say it is fundamentally a business issue, and every business leader should have an AI strategy and be working on that in coordination with both their legal counsel and their CISO. And it's very important that this is seen as a business issue. For that reason, I think, it is always going to be a full board issue, as well as, there are specific aspects of it. So when I got my NYU degree, I was promptly, punished by being put on the audit committee of every company that I was on, because at the time there was the SEC proposal that was a little bit stronger worded on who is your expert on this. But that said, I think that this is one of those issues where you say, if we have to file within 4 days of an incident, then we need to have that awareness and that fluency. So to the oversight question, I would liken it to every board member is responsible for looking at the financials of the company and understanding them and being able to speak to them. However, not every board member is expected to be an expert on that, and that is why you have typically a public company CFO, ex-CFO, who is the head of the audit committee, and you have several of those on your audit committees. So in a similar way, I do not think that every board member needs to all of a sudden, start figuring out how to code in Python and understand, how an LLM is structured. But you do need people who are deeper than others, who can do that translation engine between the CIO and the board members, who can intelligently sort of absorb the information in the meeting and ask the questions back. And even that board member, I think there was a question about how do you stay up to speed on this? People are doing this all day long as their jobs. And when I talk to people and say, how do you stay up to speed on this? They say, well, I study it for 4 hours a day. And many of us don't have 4 hours a day, but staying relevant and up to speed on it, reading articles, listening to podcasts and webinars, all of those things. You need to have 1 or 2 board members who are really, dedicated to being in that lane and being your technology person. And that's just a board skill that I think is not going to go away. Every company is a software company at this point. It may be a software company that, makes widgets or cars or whatever, but it is a software company at the back end of the company, and companies need to staff their boards appropriately.
And there is this really is very helpful, Lisa, that we have several questions on board training, education. One, Colleen Meckengert was asking how we determine what level of technical understanding is necessary for responsible oversight at the board and C-suite level. And it sounds like what you're saying is that you need a couple of people who can dig in and go much deeper. But then, I mean, personally, I do think it's such a critically important issue for boards that all board members who are in such senior positions should have at least some familiarity and awareness with what the potential opportunities are. And in large part because it impacts every aspect of the business, both from a security standpoint as well as an AI opportunity standpoint. But others, do you disagree, agree?
I'll just say one more thing on that, at the risk of taking up too much time. At several of my boards, we talk about a T-shaped skill set, and the T-shape is, across a broad spectrum of things related to the organization. Is it marketing, finance, cyber, AI, technology? Can this person speak to those things and have a strategic conversation about it? And then there's the vertical of the T, which is where do they have deep domain expertise? So you need to have people who can speak to everything, which is why a lot of boards in the past have been hesitant to put CIOs on their board, because oftentimes they're in this lane where they see everything from the lens of technology, and it's sort of like, how do you broaden your perspective? So that's something that I think about when I think about the level of expertise. You need a couple people that have that deep expertise, but not everyone.
And to pivot just a little bit off of that point, I would say, when you think about how you're going to educate your board, I think Lisa makes a brilliant point. They're educating themselves first and foremost. They are millions of ways that boards are getting information. Either they're reading, getting podcasts, or they're at other board meetings where they're getting information, or they are doing podcasts, or they're going to NACD. There are a million ways they're getting information, but I do think you have a duty within the company to make sure that your board members understand how you are looking at AI, like what your strategy is about AI, how you're planning to deploy it, how you're planning to use it to improve your operations, like how you are trying to govern it. I think you have the duty to try to make sure that they are aware of all of that information, with respect to your entity. But what I would also say is it is never remiss if you want to share articles or information with your board about AI, you can certainly do that. And it is not remiss of you to bring in external speakers if you think that would be helpful to the understanding of your board as it relates to how you are working with AI, or for that matter, cybersecurity or anything else.
Jocelyn, that's a great point, and I'm plugging in, excuse me, but it's a terrific point in terms of having speakers, but also having external auditors, because I do think a lot of times a company may be very insular and focusing on thinking that they have it figured out. And sometimes even the more mature companies are the ones that actually go ahead and have the external experts who come in. It just provides a new perspective. Sometimes it's a cross-industry perspective. Sometimes it's just a review of what's happening inside. So on one hand, it can give you good insight. And on the other hand, it also shows that the company is doing all it can or taking adequate measures to mitigate or address potential risk.
I totally agree.
Yeah, I agree. And just to add to the points that Jocelyn, Lisa, and Judy, you've made, if we think about it, almost every committee has like a consulting partner, right? So if you think about audit, we have like the audit partners. We, for compensation, we have basically people comp partners, right? And I think what's emerging more and more now is that some of these players, it's either audit companies like PwC and EY, et cetera. They're building expertise, right, on AI and on cyber, right? And they're getting many of us together. I don't know if some of you have attended, right? But they're both doing training sessions as well as really building cohorts of individuals. I've attended a few of those. I would say to any board member here, try to get on those lists and attend, because you start to get to be part of a community of those folks that Lisa mentioned, the people that are T-shaped, but starting to build the expertise that are sort of depth in this area, right? And it's a good network to get articles and to get better training.
And that's a lot of also our focus at the NYU Center for
And with you as well.
Cybersecurity.
Exactly. The work that you're doing with NASDAQ as well, right, is to start to build that expertise too.
And the networks
And the network, totally.
People we can call for questions and those types of things based on the classes or programs or certificates that we've done the time together. So it helps to talk about the important, interesting things, but also to know who are the people that you need to
Right.
call. We have a great question from Andy Azalina asking for advice for an approach for briefing a newly formed, fairly immature board that's more like a startup.
I can take that because I just came out of my last role was at a startup. And so maybe the question is, those board meetings tend to be very different than sort of more formal meetings. They're really a lot more about sort of execution and things like that. So my advice and what I've done with startups, either the boards that I'm on or having been in a startup, is to take board members aside and do one-on-ones offline, because sometimes it's difficult to have that conversation within the boardroom and to make the time. So I would would sort of meet up with some of the board members. Many of them were VCs at times, and so it would allow me to build a relationship with them, but also have a conversation about particularly what's the right time and what's the level of effort that we need to put forth, right, relative to whether it's cyber or AI, right? And usually at a startup, it's difficult to think about risk, governance, because you're really going go, go, go. So talking to your board members about and with the CEO, right, of what's that balance and what's the kind of like minimum viable product of risk management that we need, whatever stage we're in, right? That's appropriate, particularly to protect the customer base, right? And protect the data and make sure that we are compliant as well.
Yeah, I would just add to that for a lot of startups or smaller companies, make no mistake, this is an existential risk.
Yes.
And there are very few things that can shut down a company faster than, you do the miraculous sale because you've got amazing product market fit. You punch way above your weight. You get into a Fortune 100 company, you have that logo, and then you have some sort of security breach that says like, hold on, we cannot work with this company. So, I would urge, even in smaller companies to really think through, how do you if you cannot do it with a full-time rock star CISO, which are getting very expensive, can you do, a fractional CISO? Can you do one of the outsourced, like I'm thinking like an Arctic Wolf or somewhere where they come in and they, Anna, you may do it at SentinelOne as well, where you are engaging with a third party to, bring on some of the expertise that you may not have the capacity to manage yourself yet, but it is still critically important to young companies. In some ways, even more, a large company can sort of absorb the hit. They have the reputational sort of structure to be able to handle it, and they have the the crisis communications and the have done the tabletop exercises to recover quickly. With a smaller company, that may not be the case. So thinking through, what questions do I need to ask as a board member or as a senior leader? Do we have anybody in charge of it, for example, and if they are, how are they how are they using existing resources, or how, if we can't do that, how are we engaging with the external resources to help us make sure that we're on top of it?
And on the tabletop point, we've talked a lot for over the years for the importance of tabletop exercises that address cybersecurity risk. And I do think presently a lot of companies should be integrating AI risks into the tabletop exercises. One, because they're important and they're happening. And two, through these exercises, it helps to increase awareness, and also important throughout the corporate levels, for employees, and how it impacts us in our personal lives, because we also are so interconnected that we're seeing increases in attacks and targeting of C-suite and board members, and that also then can compromise the confidentiality of the companies that they're involved in, as well as any employee who might have sensitive data or the ability to move money in an organization, et cetera.
And I'm going to just chime in here because I'm really passionate about laptops. I think they are hugely important because they provide you a space to work out, how you're going to respond when there's a crisis. And when the crisis comes, is not the time for you to figure out the roles and responsibility, is not the time for you to figure out like how I'm going to handle this. It's the time for you to execute because you don't have any time. And if you have that skill set primed and ready to go, you're going to be better by far in outcome just for having done the work. So I'm a huge proponent of always doing tabletops just to make sure that you're ready when the crisis actually hits your door, because inevitably crisis hits everybody's door at some point of one type or another, and to have the skill set that is ready to go and is coordinated, because that's a huge part of it, is coordinated and ready to go, is, I think, invaluable.
Right. And as we talk about risk and board member focus, we have a question from Jay Holt asking if attention to the insurability or non-insurability of risk might help focus board members on some of these issues. I don't know if one of you want to address that.
Yeah, I can address it. Yes, the answer is yes, right? Because every board member cares not just about sort of risk, but also sort of the financial expenses or the financial view of this, right? And insurance is a big portion of that, whether it's cyber insurance or what people are doing now for, I mean, to be honest, I think the AI insurance piece is an interesting conversation that is happening. Does that exist? To what extent? And are people willing to do it? So I'm I'm on the board of a university where I run the cyber committee, and actually one of the big topics there really is about insurance costs every year, and what can we do from a risk management framework, and how do we present that to the insurance companies, right? And how do we get the best, basically the best optimized insurance program, right? Associated, in a sense, getting some rewards, for the work that we're doing. Is there a way that we can show that we're getting better? And then that allows us to really either maintain, usually it's about maintaining the cost of insurance, as opposed to reducing, but that's a good thing, right? So, very top of mind of boards.
I agree. I think, boards should be looking at how do we insure against this risk. That said, cyber insurance costs have gone up and up and up and up, and cyber insurance coverage has gotten, much more discerning and much more, there are carve outs and there are qualifiers in there. So, understanding that you will have residual risk, that most insurance is not going to cover the reputational damage or the lost revenue. They may cover the cost of the actual breach or the incident. So, so I think you cannot rely on insurance as, oh, we'll just get an insurance policy and that will cover us. You must have the things in place to be more resilient. And, I think the critical thing, and it's just, just to, one more cherry on top for the tabletop exercises, being able to respond in a timely way. Things like making sure that your backups actually work. I think that's the kind of thing that can, be the difference between getting your company back online and operating again, or sitting for quite some time in a situation where you have to decide as a company, are you willing to pay for ransomware or not? So that's the kind of thing that I would say companies need to be aware of. Insurance is not going to save you here. Insurance can help defray some of the costs.
And I would add just one thing. I know we're trying to go to another point here, but the one thing I would add is the other thing to note about insurance is insurance companies are sophisticated. So they're going to look at the program you have around your AI. So it is not, while you can mitigate the risk by buying insurance, underneath your program, you need to have some defense mechanisms. You need to have some governance because insurance companies are sophisticated and they're going to base their level of insurance on the cost and whether they will insure you based upon, how well situated you are with respect to responding to the risk, because they are also managing their risk and their dollars and their investments. So that's the thing to recognize, that it's not a get out of jail free card. You still are going to have a governance program underneath it in order to be able to get any insurance. Should some exist for AI, which I'm not sure it actually does at this moment. I'm sure they will be developing it, but
while we were talking about insurance, one of the areas that comes up a lot is the challenge of metrics and evaluating the risk. Lisa, if you could talk a little bit about what governance practices or concrete metrics boards might ask management to report to show how AI is being used, whether AI is improving versus harming decision-making quality, and also if there are metrics on the cyber side as well.
Yeah, sure. I think there's a series of things. First, I think it's just getting an inventory of where are we as a company running AI or running experiments around AI, and really sort of, until you understand that inventory and that landscape. And that, by the way, also sort of helps you with that thing that we talked about at first, which is making sure people are using, a corporate approved LLM, because all of these experiments should, in theory, be tying back to that in some way. But, and where are we using it with our vendors? So I think the first step is really, what is the inventory? For AI specifically, there are fewer places to be able to say, there's an industry standard. For cyber, you can say, have we looked at a NIST score? Have we looked at some of the other sort of standard scoring? And where do we fall on those? And I would urge companies still not to say, oh, well, we're a 4 out of 5, so that's pretty good. Like we can go, do other things. I think it's really inspecting it and saying, for us as a company, do we understand what our crown jewels are? Do we understand where our data is and what the risks are for that data? And then related to that, is any of that data feeding into an LLM? If it is that LLM private or public? So it's really just getting those, starting to get those readouts, starting to make sure that you are working with people like Jocelyn in your company to say, have we contractually, put guardrails around this so that the company cannot use our data to educate their LLM if that's appropriate? So doing all of these things, I think is there's just some standard hygiene. We're a little bit things like standard scorecards and metrics, but saying, getting a status of what are the pilots that we're running? How are we testing that? Have we run an A/B test of what a human looks like versus what a model looks like? And is the model getting better or worse, or is it comparable to the human interaction? All of those things I think are things that they're a little bit like, they're not quite quantitative enough to stick on a chart without explanation, but they're starting to get there. And I think those are some of the things that you can look at.
Great points. Thank you. And I see a question from one of our other MSCRS Masters in Cybersecurity Risk and Strategy alumni, Ricky Davis. Let's talk a little bit about agentic AI. Ricky is asking if the acceleration in the use of AI agents is obviously creating new opportunities as well as different risks to organizations. Is this a different or supplemental conversation with the C-suite and boards with regard than the conversation we've been having on generative AI, or they should be having on Gen AI?
I am on different kinds of boards, an auto board, more SaaS type boards. And it's interesting. We've looked at AI around kind of 3 areas. One is agentic AI and what's the, sort of how do how do we look at that, and what is our starting with just a risk management framework around that, and what is our policy and governance, and what is the organization doing that? I think the second one is around Gen AI, and that has more to do with its use, privacy, and things like that. The last one we've looked at is what I call now more traditional AI. So this is more AI ML models in congruence with, let's say, hardware. Think about robotics or places where you're looking at vision systems and or cameras, where you have information and it has to sort of process information. So I would urge companies to really think about those three areas and not just look at Gen AI. And from a board perspective, because each of our boards has different needs, right? If we can think about those parameters. On my auto board, for example, we spend a lot of time thinking about the last one, which is cameras, sensors, whatever. By the way, what's the privacy and what's the AI and who can get in, right? As opposed to on my software boards, it's a lot more about Gen AI and agentic, informed processes or workflows, right?
Great, thank you. And Jocelyn, you've been a leader in incident response at both preparation and response at your organization for many, many years now. With regard to AI, what should a leadership team and board ensure is in place before the first AI-related incident occurs or is reported? Whether that's a data leak, hallucination in board documents, a regulatory inquiry, or something else. And what can we learn from cybersecurity incident response? Is it the same? Are there things that are different?
I would say, I've referred to it before. You really want an AI governance program because you really need a framework that you are trying to get everyone aligned to. And I realize it's not going to be perfect and there are going to be things that fall outside of it. But if you don't have anything, I think you're really in a bad place if an incident happens of some sort. So you really want to get that governance in place. You really want to get the guidelines out, and you really want that process to be working. Then when you think about the incident, I think that there is some similarity across any type of sort of crisis that you could have. And there are things that you can pull from cybersecurity to help inform how you're going to respond. For example, if you're having an incident, and I think Lisa or maybe Anna referred to it earlier, you're thinking about what's your PR? What's your response going to be? How ready are you for that? And how are you ready to mobilize? And I think those are the types of things that are similar. I think what is different, perhaps, is maybe the public's reaction to that. I'm not sure because I've not seen this happen yet, but I think it'll be interesting to see how the public reacts to something that happens. There is some exhaustion around cybersecurity incidents, I would say. And so they don't sort of garner the same amount of press or outcry that they did, say, 10 or 15 years ago. That's not true for AI. So I think there will be some things that are different. I'm not sure that's one, but I pointed out as a potential place where there will be some differences.
Thank you. So we have 4 minutes left, or 3 minutes left now. I would love to hear, there's so many things that we could cover in just such a short time. If we can just go around for each of you, what you think, either points that you want to make that we didn't get to, or a key parting knowledge. Lisa?
Sure. I would say two. One is just to re-underline what Anna started with, which is our biggest risk on both cyber and AI remains humans. Teach your teams how to use these tools. That's a two-sided story as well. It's the defense as well as there are enormous opportunities. And that's my second point here is I am a huge tech optimist. I think these tools are absolutely amazing. And I have seen some examples of companies using them in incredible ways. I think some of the great companies of the AI age have not been born yet. And we will see the companies that figure out AI and learn to adopt it and integrate it into the way that they work pull ahead. And the companies that choose to sit on the sidelines and wait and see start to fall behind. So I would urge you and your companies to take deep looks at AI and how you can start integrating it into your operations.
Right. Jocelyn?
Yeah, I'll just piggyback on that and say I think the same is true for the workforce. I think the workforce needs to embrace AI. I think it's hugely transformative. I think it has the capacity to augment, and I think Anna was talking about this, augment how people work. And it will change the way we work. But I think those who embrace it will be much better situated than those who are not. I think it is going to change many things and the way we think about them and the way we do them. And I think we've not yet even begun to see it. So I would say go out and play, learn and understand it. If you are in an entity, I would say, think about the governance, think about how you're going to, issue guidelines, but also how you're going to train people and help them tool up to this new technology. And with that, I think I'll cede my time.
And Anna, last but not least.
Last, Jocelyn and Lisa did a great job. So I'll just say, go hands-on. Don't be afraid to try it, whether it's leveraging models or actually, I've been trying to learn Cursor and I've tried to, can I develop code of my own? Can I develop a feature on my own? What does that take? I'll tell you, I feel incompetent at times, but right, I think that feeling is okay. This is new for many of us, and just be willing to experiment.
Excellent advice all around. And I do think it's important to recognize that things are changing incredibly quickly. We're still working on figuring out cybersecurity, and now we have AI as a massive game changer, not just on the cybersecurity landscape, but integral and at the core of our businesses. And so recognizing that it is a constant challenge, even for people living and breathing in this space, to stay up to date and to understand the different programs. So things like this, I appreciate the three of you from your incredibly busy schedules, making time to join us in Zoom land with the NYU Center for Cybersecurity, and also for our audience joining on this. We have save the date, February 5th. We will have a Women Leaders in Cybersecurity conference in person in New York City. 2026 is our 10-year anniversary of this kind of phenomenal programming through Women Leaders in Cybersecurity. So thank you all again for a great program, all the great advice, and for joining us. And we will see you soon.